All right. Good morning. This is Zach Talbert from the podcast on pastoral succession and pastor succession planning. And I'm alone today. Andreas and Nathaniel aren't with us, but I have Jeff Urke on the line. And Jeff is a good friend and someone that I worked with for 5 years in California, church together. And he took over from what was essentially the founding pastor of the church just this last year. And so I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself and what he's doing here.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I'm honored to be here with you and hopefully just give some insight into our situation. I work for Atascadero Bible Church. We affectionately call it ABC. So we'll refer to it as ABC Church. And I've been here 10 years on staff and just recently, as of last September, took over as lead pastor following a 37-year tenure from our previous lead pastor. And we had a succession plan that was about 2 years in the making and kind of walked through that. And so I'm happy to talk about that. And however I can just be of some sort of help and insight into your process, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, that's awesome. I left ABC Church about December 2020 is when I moved and came into my new role in the Seattle area. So I saw part of the succession plan starting to unfold. So yeah, I'm just interested to hear how that went. I would love to hear just the first question is, what was the plan? What was the strategic plan that your church had? How did you guys put it in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the word strategy gets thrown around a lot, and I would love to believe or love to even share with you that we had a thought through, thorough strategy. I think far less than strategy, we just operated out of a value system. And at ABC, there's been a strong, long-standing value of investing and empowering in the next generation. And so I think our previous senior pastor, Tom, did an excellent job of elevating younger staff members, of empowering us, providing opportunity for leadership, Zach and myself included, being a part of the teaching team early on. And probably 8 years ago, maybe, our senior pastor implemented a teaching team where he reduced his teaching load to close to 60% and just allowed for opportunity for younger leaders to step up and to teach and to lead. And so it was more of a dynamic shift, I think, that took place over a maybe 10-year period of time, more than a strategy. I think the strategy was, let's transition early. That's always been Tom's mindset. And so if anything, the strategy was transition leadership, implement a succession planning earlier than later. In other words, don't wait till it's too late. And I think that's the big difference is if you don't operate out of a value system that values next generation leadership, then you're going to do it late. It's going to happen way too late in the game. And a lot of times that's at the detriment of staff and church culture, and even, fruit. At some point you start to wane in fruit and investment. So anyway, strategy, I think, is do it early.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I got to see the teaching team and be part of that with you for several years. And the more I've seen other churches and have interviewed other pastors, I'm just realizing that's more and more of a rarity to have that kind of a culture where the senior pastor is developing teachers and pushing forward good teaching, even if it's not him, from next generation guys. So yeah, really, really love how Tom did that. The elders, what role did they have? ABC is an elder-led church. And so what role did they have in the succession plan with you and Tom?
Yeah, I think our elders did a really good job of deferring to Tom's desire to do the succession plan early. And just when I say early, Tom retired about 3 years before he really should have from a career perspective, in terms of just his family dynamic and, retirement age and all these other things. And so so he could have stayed 3 more years, could have stayed 10 more years. It just from a vibrance and energy perspective, but really did it before his family was even ready for him to retire. And so I think our elders, the role there is just to celebrate that. But really Tom led the way because he was saying, I want to do this early. I want to make sure that we have a plan in place so that I don't wait until the elders have to have an awkward conversation with me. So really he took the ball down the court, so to speak, so that there didn't have to be an interruption from elder leadership to be able to say, hey, by the way, it's, you're getting a little long in the tooth kind of conversation. And so they were really more functioning as cheerleaders, I think, in the process of saying, yeah, we're going to support Tom as he continues to process through this. And then I think the most significant role in the actual play out of the succession plan with our elders is the more the vetting process of me, and prayer process of me as the next leader. Is Jeff the right next guy? And I think that's really where our elders step in and are able to kind of determine that. And ultimately that's going to be and was their decision as an elder, as Zach alluded to, elder-led church. They needed to be able to make that decision of who the next lead pastor would be.
I muted you there for a second. Sorry, I meant to unmute myself.
Gotcha.
So really good at the Zoom thing still. So you think 2 years into COVID, we would be better at it.
Figure it out.
Yeah. So you talked quite a bit about all of these different aspects of your succession a little bit, but were there things that went particularly well? You talked about the teaching team, you talked about it being early, but were there anything else that you'd want to expand on?
Yeah, things that went well. I think that some of the things I didn't see at the time that I can see now in hindsight are ways that Tom handed off responsibility early and created a vacuum and a void of leadership early on. So we had a 2-year window. So we announced to the church that I would take over as the lead pastor in 2 years' time. And then we let that 2-year window play out. And what happened in that 2-year window was that, hey there, how's it going?
Hey, I'm Jeff. Well. Jeff, it's good to meet you. I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of this interview and asking some questions.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
It looks like you're in a really cool, cozy little flat somewhere in Europe.
Yes, that's right. This is absolutely real. This is not a green
absolutely
screen.
real.
Yes. He has the best podcast view for sure.
So good.
Hey, Andreas, it's good to see you. Good morning.
Exactly.
So for all of the podcast listeners out there, Andreas just jumped in. Jeff was just going through, what the positives of his succession and transition. So
Zach was asking what went well, and I think one of the most significant things that not all of us as a staff at the time even understood the significance of it, but in this 2-year window of succession, Tom intentionally, he didn't even tell us necessarily, but he intentionally planned to be away from the church for long periods of time. He intentionally handed off the tactical leadership of everything. And so he wasn't supervising any employees. He wasn't leading any team meetings. He wasn't really making too many organizational decisions independently. He was still making organizational decisions, but he was doing it in tandem with myself and another leadership team. But he did such a good job of releasing so many things early on that by the time we got down to the final months, people literally would ask, so what does Tom do here at ABC? And tongue in cheek, but still like there's some real world kind of questions about how much investment and time. And we talked to him with behind closed doors, and Tom said, that's exactly what I want people to be asking, is what is he doing here still? Because it looks like everyone else is carrying the weight, and he created a vacuum of leadership that was so easy and natural for me to step into as a result, that when the time came for actual retirement day, virtually none of my job description or job duties changed. Everything that became my role as senior pastor, I was already doing. The only thing that changed was the title, and of course the intangible weight and pressure of being the lead pastor at that point. So that was a gift to us and to our staff. It helped for our church to, I really don't think our church saw our leadership skip a beat as a result, because we were already effectively leading in most all areas. And so it was just this fluid. Tom's retiring, we celebrate him. We were able to really celebrate him and his history and investment in the church. And we moved right on with what we had already planned. I had created a strategic plan, 3-year strategic plan for our church by that point that was already in process. And so we just got to march through our objectives on the strategic plan, as opposed to spending time trying to figure out, which way's up, and gosh, how am I going to carry all this, and who's going to do this and who's going to do that, and what's the team arrangement going to look like. And I don't think there was any anxiety even amongst our team of, is anyone going to change their job or lose their job? Or it's just, no, this is our team. We're moving forward as a team, and we're going to do what we've been doing for months now. And so it was very fluid that way. I think that's probably the best thing I could say as far as what went well.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, man. Is there some things, again, I was on staff with you, so I saw some of this transition happening before I took my new role in Seattle. But were there some things that you wish would have been done differently, or some things with maybe just even communication style, or was there anything that you felt slowed you down in some ways that, maybe even you and Tom have processed this, if you could go back in time and redo it, what would be some things you might change?
Yeah, I think we would have communicated better and more regularly with the church about it. We had an announcement, in whatever year that was, 2 years prior to 2019. And then didn't speak of it again for a year and a half. Until it came time to sort of decide when Tom's final weekend would be. And I think just a couple of months before that, we announced to the church that this would be Tom's final weekend and we're going to have a celebration for him, et cetera. But really didn't talk to the church much about it. So there was a season there kind of in the 18-month window, that last 6 months, where people were kind of going, is there still like a transition plan in place, or is Tom not going to retire anymore? I thought he was. And all along, it was just still right on time with what we had planned, but we lacked to communicate that and give people, kind of maybe the clarity and the confidence that comes with clarity as a result of that. The other thing in terms of communication is we didn't communicate really well to the church of what Tom's trajectory would look like post-retirement. And I had asked for him to consider taking a year away from our church. And he's been honoring that. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I think that's been helpful for our team to get kind of our footing as a team and figure out who we are in our unique DNA. But we didn't communicate that much to the church either. We weren't able to say with clarity, Tom's going to be away from the church for 12 months, but then he's going to come back. And when he comes back, this is what you're going to expect, et cetera. I think we could have done a better job of communicating that. And the other thing, I think, as it relates to some of those tactical things that can be awkward when someone's leaving and a new person's taking over, the more clarity you can get on those things, the earlier on, the better. I think I'd have preferred to have the conversations about what does retirement, mean for you? What is your desire for involvement in the future look like? how much time do you plan to take off, or should we plan for you to take off, et cetera? Maybe like in that, year prior, to talk through some of that, and even just put it in writing and just say, hey, here's the written plan. I think there are some churches that have done that really well. I know John Piper did that really well. He had a pretty exhaustive sort of manifesto of, here's what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do it, when I'm going to do it, and why, and gave some real clear directives for the new team to say, this is how they'll step into the void of leadership. I won't do memorial services or funerals, or I'm not going to take a counseling appointment, or, any of these things without that coming from the team, because I want people to start to come to them instead of to me. So some of those things, none of those type of things have been an issue, but more just the timing and the discussion of timing. The clearer everybody is, the earlier, that just the more peace everybody has about it. And so those are the two things I'd say, some clarity in terms of timing, and then just communication to the church about those things, which is really helpful. So.
I think a question which I have as well, and it may be redundant, is in the search process, as you were transitioning from the former leader and it ended up being you in the end, did your church use any consultants at all to broaden the net in terms of looking at potential successors, or was it quite clear early on that it was an internal candidate and that candidate was going to be you? Was there a broader search that involved consultants or other professional services to help them look at candidates?
Yeah, we didn't use a external consultant or a process or a search. I think that I think there's some health in that, depending on the organizational health and kind of the trust levels. This is kind of funny side note. I did a personal study in just kind of asking and exploring what's my role as I feel a burden of leadership for this church. How much should I myself as a young leader speak up? There we go. Part of my desire was, I'm not going to be an assertive or an overly assertive leader. I think I need to maintain a humble approach and posture, and recognize that God might have someone else to lead this organization that's far better suited than me. And that was really important to me, but I also don't want to not say it. I want to go through a process and not have said, hey, I would love the opportunity to lead. So that's a sticky thing when you don't have an external, maybe consultant coming in and going, okay, we're going to review this internal candidate, and these three external. We're going to do search for external, whatever. So that creates a bit of tension, maybe internally, to not have an objective process. And for me, I think at the end of the day, it came down to God's going to do what God's going to do. I trust the sovereignty of God in this process. And it's okay for me to voice my burden and desire for our church, and that I want the opportunity. And all of the case studies in the business world, point to an internal candidate as far more successful in terms of longevity. I think it's 30% of all external candidates flame out within 2 years. The statistics kind of mind blowing. Maybe you guys might know that, you're like doctoral candidates and stuff, but it's really, really high. The attrition for an external candidate is extremely high.
You're talking about CEO succession when you say in the business world.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I kind of looked at some case studies and things, and there was a couple of things written for the church specifically in that regard too, but someone who owns the current vision of the church, that understands the values and the history, and has kind of organizational culture embedded in them, just has a better shot at transitioning fluidly. So I wanted to kind of share all that, and I didn't share as much as I maybe could have. I didn't need to, because the attention kind of began to point to me without me having to say too much anyway. but that does create, I guess what I'm trying to say, Andres, is the lack of an external objective organization consultant can create some inner turmoil and tension in terms of who speaks about what and who speaks up and doesn't speak up. And, I think, to be honest, I think they'd have had a hard time going the route of an external candidate as a result of that. There would have been a lot of pushback amongst our leadership because there wasn't an objective source saying, no, you need to look at these options. So I would, I guess would say I'm a big proponent of that, of using an external kind of consulting organization to walk through that.
Yeah, I would say too, as having been here and seen the internal process of what went on at ABC, as you said, you joked, yeah, we might already know this. We've definitely done some literature review. And so we've seen a lot of that literature of the internal candidate, and not just in for-profit, but in nonprofits and in churches as well. It's far higher if it's, especially the statistic is way higher if it's an internal candidate for a long tenured, outgoing leader. And so it just made sense. And for me being on staff when you were announced as the new incoming senior pastor, there wasn't any doubt from any staff member, as far as I know, that you shouldn't have been the guy. So it was just a pretty clear, yep, that makes sense. This is who God has for this church. I have to make clear, for our probably millions of listeners at this point, Andreas.
Oh yeah, it's going viral.
I have to make clear that I didn't leave the church because Jeff took over. So I felt the timing was a little poor there, but
curious timing there, Zach.
I just tried to make your transition more difficult or easier, depending on how you viewed it. But
not easier.
So just our family felt the call to the Northwest, but man, I selfishly I had to mourn not getting to work with Jeff under his leadership. So we saw that for years, the quality of leader he is. And so I think it made it easier on the elders, made it easier on Tom to be able to do that. So yeah, well, Jeff, you talked a lot about the transition timeline already, which was one of our next questions. So I think we've covered that ground pretty well, but we'd love to know, and you can get into this as much as you can or would like to, but was there a budget for the transition, for the timeline? Did you feel in particular, you talked about, Tom getting some time away. I'm assuming, he had some paid sabbatical or something of that nature. Were there any other things that you felt helped financially as far as setting you up for success?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, there was no budget, no planning for any extra expenses or anything in that process. I think one of the things that made that possible is that we've been relatively blessed financially as a church. In other words, we weren't month to month scraping by and figuring out, okay, how do we carry a pastoral team of 5 for a season? And actually we had 6 because we had a 2-year temporary pastoral guy that was here with us. That was Tim, Zach, and you remember that. But we had to, we're now a team of 4. And so we had to kind of carry an extra salary for a season because of the team of 6 reducing down to ultimately the team of 4. And beyond that, we continued to pay Tom through the end of the year, which was about a 5-month window where he still received a salary from the church. And so in order for us to be able to do that, yeah, we would have had to budget, X number of dollars to be able to cover a sort of if you want to call it a retirement severance, and maintain some of the health benefits that come with that and whatever else. We would have had to create a budget, but because of our just financial blessing as a church, it wasn't an issue. We were able to float that just within our normal annual budgeting process. So that was helpful.
Another question is, how did the church support you when you came in terms of assimilating? Because you said although it felt like you just moved from doing the same duties you'd been doing, and then all of a sudden you had the mantle of being senior pastor, did you feel a significant increase in helping you assimilate into that role when it finally happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that the church itself, the body, has been amazing in helping the transition, both by providing grace. I had two really hard kind of COVID related decisions that several people, took note against, and yet, that the language was always, hey, we understand, like, you're figuring this out. We understand this is a new role, et cetera. So that's maybe like on the worst case, like the most negative side is, hey, we're having a hard time with this. We don't agree with this, but we get it. We're going to kind of go with it in grace. On the positive side of the pendulum, people just overtly encouraging me and just saying, hey, we're praying for you. We're praying for your family. We've had, more people this year probably than in the last 10 years of ministry at this church, want to take us out to dinner as a family, or, just drop an extra note of encouragement in the mail, just to say, we're with you, we're for you, we're praying for you. We love you. And so I think our church body has really brought that support. And it's not that the leadership hasn't supported me or our elders haven't supported, because they have, but there hasn't been anything like real specific of like, man, we're going to do this intentionally to help you assimilate. It's been more just a kind of an overarching, community-wide feeling of support that I've very much felt and been encouraged by.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you brought up COVID, and we have two kind of trajectories we went on when starting this whole process in this podcast, and kind of two targets of research. And one is people that have taken over for senior pastors that have been either the founding pastor or long tenured pastors, and you obviously fit that criteria, but you also fit the criteria of taking over leadership during COVID. And and as we went through the research of pastors taking over in COVID in the last few years, we found a common thread of just real discouragement. You brought up a couple of the harder conversations you had with some congregants, but we'd love to just know generally from you, and you're one of the more positive people I know. But for you, was COVID taxing for you? Was it discouraging? How did it affect your transition? And how is ABC doing coming out of it?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'll answer it a couple different ways. I'm going to save the best for last, the most encouraging kind of moment for last, but let me tackle some of the hard things. Obviously, COVID's been hard on everybody. I think as irrespective of our best attempts to be creative with church, I think the biblical call is the ecclesia, the gathering of believers, that has taken such a hit. And when I say gathering of believers, I mean in person, circling up together, participating in worship, communion, ordinance, baptism, teaching of God's word, etc. And I think that every church in America and probably worldwide has experienced some degree of attrition as a result of COVID, that is relatively catastrophic for some churches. And at minimum, it's a setback. It's a pause in forward momentum. I think that the current, I don't know, Barn is still doing some research on it, but the most recent statistic was that a return from attendance over 2019. So if you put 2022 over 19, it's about a 27% decline in average church attendance in the United States. And our church is no exception. We're about 15% right now, down from where we were in 2019. So if you just take attendance alone, and I know attendance is not the marker for everything. If you look at where the energy of the gathering exists, it's still Sunday mornings, for our church. And yes, we do a lot of other things, and there's a lot of discipleship happening in group ministry and recovery and all these other things that God is working those things, but the Sunday morning energy is irreplaceable for a church. And so when you have a decline of 15%, at best it's a big wrench in the spokes, and it just slows things down. And so our challenge is, how do we rebuild that? How do we rebuild the momentum and continue in the energy? The other question though becomes, who left and why did they leave? And so on a more kind of, let's just say, transition of leadership during COVID. So let's put those two, you talked about two components, transitioning from a long tenured pastor and transitioning during COVID. So we put both of those dynamics on top of each other. And you realize there's several facets playing in. We have people leaving the church because their leader left the church. So that's the transition of leadership. We have people leaving the church because their rhythm of church attendance fell off for 2 years and they simply got out of the habit. You have people leaving the church because they weren't ever really aligned with the value or the mission of the church. And so if any of the programs that they were enjoying fell off, then their opportunity fell off. And then you have people leaving the church because they saw the heart or the value system that drove the decision making during the hardest, most heated pressure cooker season the church has ever experienced. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh, I realize these are not my people anymore. That's not my political lens or my biblical lens or my view of ecclesia, et cetera. So you have, and I'll give you a great example of that. One is we took a pretty modest approach, to the shutdowns and everything else, but we did close our services and we did go online for a season and we did move to outdoor services. Well, we have a pretty rural area where there's a lot of relatively kind of what you would say fundamental, maybe evangelical, kind of Republicans, if you want to just put it bluntly. And so some of those people are basically saying, oh, if you're not drawing a line in the sand, on the politics of this, we're going to church Y down the street. And so that's the fourth reason. So you've got 4 reasons why people have left the church. So now as a transitioning leader, you don't have to just deal with the one thing. It used to just be the one thing, right? Like people left the church. Well, there was really 2. People left the church because their leader left. He was my leader, so I don't go to that church anymore because I was there because of him. I'm not too concerned about that because I want people in our church that want to be there because they believe it's their biblical calling to be part of the church. The second reason is people left the church because it was an excuse to not go to church. And that would have existed irrespective of COVID, because you have a transition of leadership and they go, well, I don't need to go if so-and-so is not speaking, or I don't need to go if, it's going to be different. I've got a reason and excuse not to go. So I'd really want to be investigating those 2 things in any other season, but now I've got these other 2 that I've got to consider. So that's where the win comes in. That's where I said, save the best for last. Is although those are all hard things and we're trying to go, my goodness, what do we do with the decimated culture of church following COVID? I look at it and go, we have an amazing opportunity to build a new culture, to work with the people that really care about ecclesia, that understand the importance of that aren't here because of an iconic leader, that aren't here because it was just a Sunday morning habit, that aren't here because they were finding a political alignment or syncretism in their church and sort of political ideology. And so now we've got the dross, so to speak, has kind of been burned away. Now, the challenge with that is there was a lot of momentum in numbers. There's always been, a lot of energy in numbers. And so can you keep the remainder, even though it's a pure remainder, or more so pure, can you keep the remainder energized? And that becomes the biggest and most significant challenge for me as a leader, is to say, how do I energize, motivate, and rally our people toward a new vision? And that would have probably been the case, irrespective of COVID, but it's far more accentuated. So it just requires that we get a tight strategic plan. It requires that we communicate vision regularly. It requires that we instill our values into a new demographic of people, and help them understand why we do what we do. So we've taken some steps to do that, that I feel like have been relatively successful. We have a lot of new people at our church. But then the other thing is, trying to just run some statistics over church attendance. It used to be that people attended church 1.7 times per month. Now it's far below that. It's just a little bit over once a month. And we've got the numbers to prove it at ABC. We've got a roster of 1,800 and a weekly attendance of 600 adults. So if you just do the numbers on that, that's only a third of the people that are coming to church every Sunday. Each Sunday there's only 1/3 of the church. And so then next Sunday we get another third, and the next Sunday you get. So it's all of those questions that are, would that have been the same challenge 2 or 3 years ago? Probably not. But do I covet the old way? No. Do I want to go back? No. Do I wish that, we had the same demographic climate that we had 5 years ago? No, I wouldn't want it, because we've got an opportunity to rebuild in a way that we never would have had before, as a result of the sort of the fire that we've been through.
So Jeff, what you're talking about sounds to me like a liminal moment when you're going through this period of transition from one stage to another. Do you think that COVID, as this catastrophic liminal moment, made a greater impact on your strategic clarity than had you come in and transitioned during regular times?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It's a great, insightful question. And I think the pressure that it puts on strategic planning is healthy. It's scrutinizing, and you've got to take, what was a rather vanilla document, and go, yeah, this is like, I could probably cut and paste this strategic plan and drop it on, a dozen other churches in our area. And now it's like, hold on a second. I don't know that that's going to work. We got a new environment to deal with. We've got to scrutinize this and really ask, is this the right thing? Is this the right way to do church? And so it requires, just kind of shoveling and piling and digging and continue to dig some more and get out, get out a little bit more of the fluff that's there, kind of hiding the real nuggets, and find out what those nuggets are of, this is going to be our thing, And so absolutely the weight on discipleship that has resulted in that exact process has been uncanny. I mean, we would have never leaned in to one-on-one discipleship relationships the way that we are as a result of that scrutiny, that we've kind of put our strategic plan under. So
let me ask one additional follow-up question. Did you find that in your succession, you had an increase of innovation amongst your leaders as you thought about the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there was innovation that came from COVID, but I don't know if the innovation was a result of the succession. I think we would have, and Zach could maybe even testify to this as part of our team during that season. I think we would have innovated either way had there not been a succession plan in place. And I don't know that the innovation was different because I had recently taken on. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was this 2-year window of overlap, right? That like I had already assumed a lot of leadership of our team dynamics. And so I was pursuing the innovation as a, if you want to call it, associate pastor, irrespective of that. And that, I think, what was necessitated by COVID, not by succession, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, Thank you so much for your time. This has been just excellent, and it's been awesome just getting to reconnect a little bit with you and yeah, hear how ABC is doing. And we're excited for the future of your church. And so, thank you for giving us your time. Is there anything else that that maybe you wanted to share about your succession plan, or advice for us as young leaders? I guess you're about our age, but you're the senior leader now. You got the gray hair going, so
I got plenty of gray hair.
Yeah, and so Andreas as well. Actually, we didn't say this in the podcast, but Andreas is a senior leader, and you took over during COVID as well, correct?
I
Andreas?
did. Well, no, I didn't. I did not.
Oh,
I came
okay.
to my church in Walla Walla in 2019.
Right before.
Yeah.
Right before.
That was even worse timing.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if there's anything else you'd like to add for us, and I'd love to just close our time in praying for you and for ABC.
Yeah, let me just say, because I know you guys are primarily reviewing this as a team in terms of looking for content and maybe sharing internally. I think the discussion that you're having is so important, and I'm thankful that you're having it, because the church has historically been really bad at succession, and there are plenty of biblical examples of screwing up succession, right? And then a couple really good ones. And if you could, imagine God dictating succession the way he did between Moses and Joshua, you can kind of look at that and go, okay, I'm going to give you a time frame. I'm going to give you a map for where you're supposed to go, and I'm going to give you a vision for what you're supposed to do. That's as good as it gets, And so I think if we could lean in and use the biblical map that's laid out for us there, and do it with humility. That's the thing. I think if I could just, say one word about succession, if you have humble leaders who are handing off to humble leaders, and I'm not overstating that for my own posture or from Tom's posture, because I think some of our tension comes from the lack of humility that I even, have struggled with. But when you have humble leaders who want the best interest of the global church, the universal church, as opposed to a name for myself or a name to be preserved for the previous, or even, some of the sacred cows that come along with that of we've got to preserve the integrity of this institution. No, when we approach it humbly and just say, this is God's church, it's his kingdom, he's going to do what he chooses. And by God's providence, we may need to close the doors of this building. That might be what God has, because that's happened before. And God's used that in mighty ways to rebirth new movements in the same region. So there's a lot of questions, that can kind of come up for what God's quote will is, but I just can't stress humility enough. That's the thing that I just see again and again. I've got a friend that just took over another church. Man, I tell you what, this guy is humble and wants the best thing for the capital C church. And that's when I've seen succession go so well, is when there's shared humility amongst two leaders, as the handoff takes place. And certainly, Tom demonstrated a lot of humility for me, towards me too. So.
Man, so good. Yeah. Well, Jeff, I'd love to pray for you and for your church as we close our time. Thanks again. God, thank you so much for ABC Church and the light that they are in the Central Coast of California, for the legacy of next generation leadership that they have established, for the legacy of caring for families and for the people that are far from you and close to you. God, this church is just such an amazing church, and a lot of that. You used Tom for so many powerful ways for 37 years. We just thank you for his legacy that he has left, a truly remarkable legacy of integrity and humility and just making difficult decisions and carrying the weight for so long. God, I have been a beneficiary of Tom's willingness to pour into next generation leaders. I know full hand full well how important that is. And I've seen it in Jeff as well. And so, God, would you just bless Jeff as he continues to come out of COVID? Would you bless this church? Would ABC have a revival that they beyond their wildest dreams, that regardless of the numbers of attendees, regardless of the average times they attend per month? God, I pray that this core that Jeff is speaking of, that they would just light this fire in the Central Coast and beyond. God, would you use Jeff and Jake and Sean and Gerald and Josh and Tiffany and Marnie and the rest of the team here at ABC, God, of godly men and women who are serving you and hunger for you? Would you just bless them and allow them to stay humble and to be used by you for your glory? Thank you for this time together. In your name, amen.